One of the most common questions I get asked from beginner content creators is, which camera should I buy? So in this video, we're going to go over everything that you need to know about buying your next camera. At the time of this recording, some of the top camera brands that I would recommend are going to be Canon, Sony, and Nikon. So we're going to talk about the different cameras that each brand has to offer, help you narrow down the right camera for you depending on what kind of shooter you are, whether you're looking for something that's very budget friendly, maybe you're the type of content creator that prioritizes photo, but you want to shoot some high quality video as well. And lastly, maybe you're the type of creator that prioritizes video and you want to take good photos. With that being said, let's jump to the computer and figure out which camera is right for you. Let's get into which specs or features I consider to be most important when considering a camera. The first consideration to make is the price of the camera. At the time of this recording, the latest and greatest iPhone is going to be sitting right around $1,600. The cameras I'm recommending today are not going to pass the $2,000 threshold. For the camera body itself, what I'm looking for is something with a flip out screen, something that I can swap out lenses on. It has the ability to plug in an external microphone, kind of like the one that I'm using right now, and something with a high quality sensor. So for those of you who don't know what a camera sensor does, it holds a lot of responsibility for what the final image looks like. So to sum it up in basic terms, it makes a good looking image. Another feature I'm looking for is image stabilization. What image stabilization does is it makes things look a little bit smoother, so that way you don't have a shaky camera. This is really good for when you're filming handheld, or maybe you're creating a travel vlog. When the camera is super shaky, it's a little bit distracting for the viewer. As a content creator, there's a good chance that you're probably going to be on your own. So having good autofocus is something that is absolutely crucial. Next up on my checklist is the ability to shoot 4K video. For those of you who don't know what 4K video or any of those resolution terms mean, it basically means that there's a lot of information crammed into this image. It makes the image look a little bit more sharper, a little bit more clear, and it gives you the ability to zoom into your image without any image quality loss. So that way it doesn't look blurry or out of focus. And practically, it's a nice feature to have because you could film content like this horizontally, and then you can crop it into a vertical image without having to sacrifice image quality. And if you plan on recording video content, there's a good chance that you're going to be prioritizing audio. So another feature that I'm looking for on the camera body is a headphone port. This way you could record audio, plug in your headphones, and make sure that the audio sounds the way that you want it to. Next, we're also going to consider battery life. When you're creating content, the last thing that you want is to be interrupted. And having a fast draining battery means that you're going to have to stop what you're doing, swap out the battery, and just interrupt that creative flow. The next consideration is going to be the weight of the camera. Now, if you plan on traveling, going out of town, throwing your camera into a camera bag, the last thing that you would want is for your shoulders to start cramping up. And I know these camera bodies don't weigh a ton, but when you're carrying something like that for a long period of time, the weight adds up. It's not uncommon to see that these camera manufacturers are actually sizing their cameras down while still producing a high quality image. The last feature that I would consider to be most important is going to be the recording time. For those of you who don't know, when you're recording videos, some cameras have a limit of 30 minutes, while some cameras have no limit at all. This is especially important if you plan on recording podcasts or something more long form, kind of like this YouTube video. Again, when you're creating, the last thing you want is to interrupt that creative flow. With that being said, let's jump over to the computer, check out some of these cameras, what they have to offer, and hopefully figure out the right camera for you. Now we're going to dive into some cameras. We're going to take a look at what each camera has to offer, just a quick little overview. Then at the end, we'll do a little bit of a comparison and see which camera would be right for you depending on your needs. The first camera that I want to introduce you to is the Canon R50. This is one of the cameras that's a little bit more budget friendly, coming in at around 630 bucks. It's well under that $2,000 threshold that we talked about earlier. The sensor size is 24 megapixels. To give you a point of reference, the camera on the back of your iPhone shoots about 12 megapixels. So with that in mind, this is definitely a high quality sensor. This camera sensor is definitely bigger than the sensor in your camera. So that means the image quality, it's gonna look a little bit sharper. And it also means that it's gonna perform better in low light situations. So if you're shooting in the evening, or if you don't have a lot of natural light in your house, this is definitely gonna be a good sensor to keep an eye out for. A majority of the cameras that we're looking at today have a similar sensor to this. You'll be able to record 4K video, has dual pixel autofocus. All you need to know about that is that the autofocus is really good. Canon is well known for their autofocus performance. It's definitely at the top in the industry in my opinion, and I've used Canon cameras before and I've never been let down with their autofocus performance. You can shoot photos at 15 frames per second. Now, practically what this means is you can go to your kid's soccer game, put on a nice lens, hold that shutter button down, and you'll be able to get some really good action shots with this. It also has that higher video recording limit. And of course, we have a flip out screen. All of the cameras that we're looking at today have this flip out screen. Not every camera has this viewfinder eyepiece up here. So if it's really bright outside and you can't see the screen, you can put your eye up to the viewfinder and still be able to see what you're shooting. As I'm looking at the overview page of this camera, you can definitely see that this camera was made and marketed to content creators specifically. It has that continuous movie recording that exceeds 30 minutes. It has fancy phrasing like vlogging made simple and convenient, movie for close-up demos. So if you're doing a product review, you can hold that up to the camera. That mode would be really good for that kind of scenario. Vertical movie mode, you can see Canon is really leaning into creating files dedicated to these social media sites. Another cool feature, you can use this for live streaming. So maybe if you're a gamer, you want to make some content that way, do some live streaming, some Twitch, maybe you're hosting a webinar, or you just want to go live while you're playing some Call of Duty or another video game. I would say this is a great intro beginner camera. My first camera was a Canon camera and it was just very intuitive. I was able to jump right in and kind of get shooting. The menu system was very clear. You could easily move through it. And that's something that I really like about Canon is that it's very approachable and it feels like the cameras are just easy to use. I'm going to have a little chart with all of the different features and specs lined up. That's going to be coming up. But again, right now we're just doing an overview of each camera. Next up is the Canon R8. Here we have a 24 megapixel sensor. Again, quick comparison. This one has a full frame sensor. It's going to have a bigger sensor compared to the R50. And what that looks like practically is you're going to be able to just get a little bit of a different aesthetic with your camera. And when you compare this with the right lens, I could do a whole deep dive video on camera sensors specifically, but all you need to know about a full frame sensor compared to an APS-C sensor like the one that we just saw on the R50 is that the full frame sensor is going to do better in low light situations, and it allows you to make the background even more blurry, kind of like if you were to use portrait mode on your iPhone. It makes it look a little bit more professional and a little bit more cinematic. With Canon, you have great autofocus, 4K video capabilities. Something cool about this camera is that it has 4K video up to 60 frames per second. That basically means it shoots high quality slow motion video. Now for someone like me, I know I like to shoot slow motion when I'm doing travel videos and stuff like that, so this really appeals to me. Has a high recording limit, has that flip out screen with the viewfinder, and apparently it's one of the lightest full frame Canon cameras. Very helpful when you're traveling, when you're carrying that camera around all day. The weight adds up. Great autofocus. It's going to focus on the head, face, and even on your eye. Here we see it's definitely leaning towards video creators. It has C-Log 3, which for a lot of you guys, you might not know what that means. This might be a spec leaning towards specifically like beginner videographers. To put it simply, it decreases the saturation and contrast about as much as you can on one of these cameras. So that way you have more control over what the final color looks like. For the average beginner, this is definitely going to be overkill and you're probably not going to use this feature. Again, another live streaming camera right here, vertical movie mode. In this higher price category, we're starting to see that image stabilization coming into play. Very cool camera. I think it's definitely leaning towards the video creator. More on that later. Next up is the Canon EOS R7. Quick overview about this camera, right under $1,400. Here we have an even higher megapixel count at about 32.5 megapixels. It is a crop sensor lens. It does have a smaller sensor size compared to the R8, which means it wouldn't do as well in low light situations. But I think the customer that they have in mind for this camera is a little bit more of a photographer, somebody who's going to be printing out the work, who needs a high megapixel count, high image quality when taking photos. Typically, the higher the megapixel, the more you're able to zoom in on those photos without losing any image quality, and you'll be able to get really high quality prints if you choose to print out your photos. Quick little side note though, 32 megapixels is not necessary for high quality printed photos if that's something that you're into. Anything above 12 megapixels is going to do just fine. And again, here we have high speed shooting, fast autofocus, image stabilization, gotta have that flip out screen. Definitely leaning towards action photography, kids soccer games, sports, things of that nature, where you don't want to miss a second, you don't want to miss a frame. Has a high recording limit, optimized for video. Love those keywords there. Very cool camera. I definitely get more of a photographer kind of vibe from this camera. Overviews for the Canon cameras is done. I threw a lot of info at you, so let's go ahead, put these specs on paper and compare them side by side to really point out the differences between these cameras. All right, so here we have the R50, the R8, and the R7. It's kind of categorized most budget friendly at the top and then the most expensive at the bottom. So with the R50, right off the bat, if you're looking for something that will shoot high quality video, a really nice entry camera, budget friendly, you probably won't go wrong with choosing the R50 if you decide to go with Canon. We have a solid sensor, 24 megapixels. So if that's something that you care about, that's something to keep in mind. But if you plan on just throwing your camera on a tripod, it's probably not a big deal. And there's a lot of stabilization options out there. You could always get a gimbal for your camera. So there's definitely ways that you could work around this. Autofocus points is a spec that I won't dive into too much, but all you need to know about it is you're probably going to get better results when it comes to autofocus. Okay, so 651 compared to the R8 at a little over 1,000. Will you be able to actually notice a difference when you are filming, when you're recording? Probably not. Each one of these cameras is going to have solid autofocus. I'd be surprised if you'd be able to actually tell the difference between them. Do you want to be able to shoot high quality slow motion? Does that make sense for your content? If not, you could probably ignore this row, this column. But for me, I know it's something that I would take into consideration because I just love to create different kind of content and I don't want to be limited by the tool in my hand. Headphone port. So the Canon R50 does not have a headphone port. You will not be able to listen to yourself back on the video. Battery life. It is on the lower end compared to the R7. However, it's still going to be pretty solid for most use cases, and there's no recording limit. Next up, we have the R8 coming in at about $1,300. One of the key differences in sensors is that the R8 is going to have a full frame sensor. So again, this is going to do better in low light. It's going to give you a different aesthetic. You'll still be able to achieve a really nice blurry background with an APS-C sensor. So don't sweat it too much. Just to reiterate, if you're a beginner, an APS-C sensor is gonna do just fine. But now we have image stabilization. So this means that the autofocus might be a little bit more snappy, a little bit fast to track your eye, track your face as you're moving about the scene. Now we have 4K 60, a headphone port, same kind of battery life as the R50, and it's a little bit heavier. All these cameras have a higher recording limit, so you don't have to worry too much about that being a factor. Lastly, the R7 coming in at $1,400. Higher megapixels, definitely leaning towards more of the photographer, image stabilization, 4K 60 or 4K slow motion, solid autofocus, has a headphone port, better battery life. These are some of the differences. I'm trying not to overwhelm you with all these specs, but to put it simply, if you're a content creator who just wants something, a nice solid camera to shoot photo, shoot video, and you're on a budget, check out the R50. If you're the kind of creator who prioritizes video, you're doing travel vlogs, you want a video camera that does solid photos, I would recommend the R8, especially if you have a little bit of a higher budget. And lastly, if you're the type of creator who prioritizes high quality photos and solid video as well, then the R7 is probably going to fit you and your shooting style the best.
Now let's dive into our Sony camera options. Sony's right up there with Canon. Now, I'm not gonna lie, there's a lot of really good cameras and it was really hard to narrow this down, but let's go ahead and just get started. So starting out with the budget friendly option, we have the Sony Alpha ZV-E10. What a mouthful, right guys? Coming in at just under 700 bucks. We have that nice flip out screen. Something to notice about this camera compared to, some of the Canon cameras is that this one doesn't have a viewfinder up top. So you only have the screen to gauge what your image looks like. It's not a deal breaker, but something to keep in mind. This is a very nice beginner camera. It's actually the camera that my wife uses for her YouTube channel. Be sure to check her out if you like the image quality of that. This is what she uses for a majority of her videos. Quick rundown on the specs. We have a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor. So again, very similar to the other sensors that we've been seeing in the Canon cameras. We have a 4K image that's actually downsized from a 6K image. So that basically means the camera records a nice big 6K image, squeezes it down into a 4K image, and the result of that makes for a little bit more of a sharper image. You have a really good autofocus, eye autofocus, so it'll make sure that your eye is nice and sharp as you are recording your talking head videos, if that's something that you're into. Flip out screen, has a product showcase. So again, if you want to present a product to the camera, this might be a good camera for you. It has this nice built-in microphone on top of the camera. So that way, if you're on the go and you don't have a extra microphone, you could probably get away with decent audio with just the camera that's on board the camera. Okay, what else? We have live streaming capabilities, image stabilization, optimized color with enhanced skin tone reproduction. In the past, some of the older Sony cameras have been not great when it comes to color science, but lately Sony's really been working on that and it has a decent color science now. So it's really cool to see that their technology has changed with consumer feedback. Pro video functions, again, this stuff, S-Log 3, that is probably overkill for a majority of beginners, but it's really nice for those who want to dive in and get their hands on as many features as the camera has to offer. Adjustable autofocus transition speeds. I will give you a little bit of a heads up. The Sony menu system isn't the most intuitive. Not gonna lie. Now, with any camera that you decide to go with, there is gonna be somewhat of a learning curve. Sony is very generous in the sense that they allow you to have as much controls over the camera that you could ever dream of, right? But with that comes a little bit more of a complex menu system. So it might be a little bit harder to navigate, a little bit harder to set up initially, but what I found when using my Sony cameras is that once you have it set up after the first time, you don't have to go through those menus too much. The Canon menu system is a little bit more intuitive than the Sony's. Is that a deal breaker for you? I don't know. I'll leave that up to you, but I just wanted to give you that extra tip as you are making your decision. Higher frames per second, so if you want to grab some action shots of your kids at a soccer game, you have that option there. Has this soft skin effect too, so this is actually a really cool feature. It does what it sounds like it does. It makes your skin look soft. It's kind of like a filter for your skin. Really cool. And something that I say with content creators when they're just starting out is like, whatever you need to do to get confident on camera, do what you got to do, right? For some people, having a soft skin effect filter is going to make them feel a little bit more presentable. That's something that I think is kind of natural. So something to keep in mind. Really cool feature. Glad to see that they have it on this budget-friendly beginner camera. A lot of information on this bad boy, solid skin tones, image stabilization. I'll be sure to link all of these pages in the description down below, so that way if you want to go back and check out some of these demo videos as you're doing more research, you could do that as well. Let's go ahead and move on. So we're looking at the Sony ZV-E10 right now. Guess what? They came out with a Mark II. Could you believe that? The price difference is going to be $1,000 compared to $700. So what is it that we get? Some of the differences that we're going to see in the Mark II is going to be a higher megapixel count. Will you be able to notice the difference between 24 and 26 megapixels? Probably not. Has 4K 60, so now we're getting into slow motion video, really high quality slow motion video. At a glance, that's going to be the main difference. There's a lot of similarities between the Mark I and the Mark II, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Moving on to one of my favorite cameras, hint hint, a little bit of foreshadowing here. Sony Alpha 6700. Very cool camera. Coming in at $1,400 is a little bit more on the pricier side. 26 megapixels. Here we have 4K 60, 6K oversampled, 422, 10-bit recording. What does all that mean? 4K 60, high quality slow motion video. You could crop in, you're not going to lose any image quality. 6K oversampled. It's taking a 6K image, all that information, all those pixels, squeezing it into a 4K image to make it look even sharper. 422 10-bit. That basically means there's a lot of color information, so that way you could adjust the colors as much as you want without making it look too weird. That might be an oversimplification of what all that means, but I think it's all that you need to know right now. This is definitely a spec that a videographer or filmmaker might look at and might want in a camera. For a beginner who's just trying to start out their YouTube channel, this is going to be way overkill. And that's a common theme that I do see with Sony cameras. I do think for a majority of the cameras that they have, it might be overkill for the beginner. But with Sony, I think they're really trying to target those freelance videographers, freelance filmmakers, because you get such great image quality, such cool features in a compact solution. It's really hard for a videographer to pass up, especially when comparing it at these different price points with other camera brands. High frame rate, 4K 120, so that means it can shoot 4K super slow motion. If you're doing a talking head YouTube video, you're not going to use it. But if you're a freelance videographer who is shooting weddings in your free time and you want to charge a pretty penny, this is probably the camera that you would pick. Great image stabilization, wide dynamic range. What does that mean? It means it takes the brightest parts of the image and the darkest parts of the image and keeps as much information in there as possible, so that way you can go in and make the image look how you want it to look in your editing software. I could go on and on about all the features that this camera has. At the end of the day, if you're a beginner, this is going to be overkill. But I will say that if video quality is something that you do see yourself diving into, if you pick up this camera, I don't see a real need to upgrade it in the future, especially if you fall into the freelance videographer filmmaker category. Another camera that I think is really cool, it's a little bit of an older camera compared to some of these other ones, is the Sony A7C. Here we have a full frame sensor, so again, bigger sensor size. It's going to do even better in low light situations. Has a lot of those features that we're looking for: 4K, flip out screen, high megapixels, great autofocus, solid battery life. Very, very nice camera. Some honorable mentions that were just over the price threshold. Here, the last camera that we looked at was the A7C. They have a Mark II now, and it has some upgraded features. Now we're starting to see that viewfinder introduced. And I gotta say, I've used Sony cameras. I typically have an external monitor, but even when I do use the screen, I'm fine with just the screen. The viewfinder is not a deal breaker for me, and that's based on my real world experiences. And lastly, another honorable mention is the Sony Alpha ZV-E1. Both of these cameras, I think they're geared definitely towards the videographer, filmmaker. So I'm not going to dive into it because I'm trying to create this video specifically for beginner content creators. Maybe you're shooting on your iPhone right now and you just want to step up your image quality just a little bit. Maybe you want to start a YouTube channel, trying to figure out the right camera for you. Again, these are going to be overkill, but the inner filmmaker, videographer in me just geeks out about this stuff because I think these cameras are so fun, so very overkill for beginners, but they're a lot of fun to use. Now let's look at all the specs on a chart side by side and categorize these cameras based on the type of shooter that you are. So hands down, if you're looking for a solid camera, if you're on a budget and you just need something that'll get the job done, that has a lot of the features that we talked about already, you're going to want to look at the Sony ZV-E10. It's a $700 camera, solid sensor. It does not have image stabilization, but again, if you're just going to throw that camera on a tripod and point it at yourself while you're doing talking head videos like this one right here, you're not going to have to worry about image stabilization. Solid autofocus, and this is kind of like the baseline for the rest of them, has that eye autofocus tracking thing, so I'm pretty sure all these cameras do now. Doesn't have 4K 60. Again, that's not a feature that a lot of people will be using if they're just starting out. It has a headphone port, guys, and compared to the Canon budget-friendly option, it's so something to keep in mind, especially if you're on the go. If you're recording a podcast, you're going to want to plug your headphones into the camera and make sure you have quality audio, so that way you don't record a big 30-minute, 1-hour video and realize that it doesn't sound good at all. So audio is huge. Headphone port is going to help you maintain that high quality audio. Solid battery life. Again, in real world situations, the battery on the Sony ZV-E10 is going to be a little bit smaller. It will drain a little bit faster, but you should be able to get through a solid YouTube video without having to change the battery. It's definitely one of the lightest, most compact cameras as well. So again, solid option here. If you're a beginner, just want to get started into that higher quality image, I really like the Sony camera, and my wife, who uses this camera for her YouTube channel, is really pleased with the image quality as well. Now, between Canon and Sony, something to consider is lens options. And I will say that Sony E-mount lenses, so that means lenses that will fit onto the Sony camera. Sony has the most third-party lens options, so you could get a really high quality third-party budget lens if budget is a concern of yours. There's more variety, more options out there as compared to the Canon RF mount or even Nikon cameras. They're newer, so the third-party manufacturers are just trying to catch up a little bit. Sony has been there a little bit longer to where the manufacturers can really provide some different options for you. We didn't spend too much time on the Sony ZV-E10, but at a glance, some of the big differences is going to be a higher price, $300 more, a little bit of a higher megapixel count, better autofocus, higher video quality in terms of slow motion video. You have 4K 60 now, and it comes with better battery life. Is it worth the upgrade? That's up to you to decide, but I just want to share some of these differences with you. Sony a6700. Now that is probably going to be my pick for this lineup. If you're somebody like me who prioritizes high video quality and you want to take good photos with that camera as well, I think you'll be solid, set, and happy with the a6700. It is going to be very much overkill for a majority of beginners, but you do have that image stabilization, a high megapixel count, great autofocus, high quality slow motion video, headphone port, better battery life. It checks a lot of boxes for someone like me, but again, for the beginner creator, it's going to be overkill. For example, my father-in-law wants to start a coffee YouTube channel. I wouldn't recommend him the a6700. I would recommend him actually something like the Sony ZV-E10 or even the Canon R50. Just something to get started. Just because it's in a lower price category doesn't mean that I wouldn't recommend them. Every camera that you're seeing here is going to be a camera that is a solid pick that will get the job done for a lot of your needs. But for me, I have a video background. I'm comfortable using the camera, so A67 is where I would be at if I were starting from scratch with the knowledge that I have when it comes to video and video production. That's a solid camera. And the rest of these cameras, I'm gonna leave them up on this chart for those beginner videographers, beginner filmmakers. The rest of these cameras that you see here, they're definitely lean towards more of like the freelance videographer, freelance filmmaker. The specs on them, not as necessary for a beginner, but I just thought I'd throw them up because I know I do have some freelance video peeps out there watching this, hopefully. Solid camera options, my top picks when it comes to Sony cameras. If you're on a budget, you're just trying to get started, Sony ZV-E10, solid pick. You'll be happy with it. Now, if you're one of those creators who prioritizes photography and you want to make high quality videos on the side of that as well, well, I think you can't go wrong with either of these 26 megapixel cameras. I would go with either the ZV-E10 Mark II or the A6700. And I make that decision mostly on the megapixel count. You'll be able to crop into your image a little bit more without losing image quality. You get that higher battery life. I will say that the A67, because of its weight, it might actually feel better in the hand. It'll make it a little bit more stable. The ZV-E10 and the ZV-E10 Mark II might be a little bit too small, a little bit too dainty. So that's something to keep in mind when comparing these videos. At this point, we've talked about Canon, we've talked about Sony. Now let's move on to Nikon cameras. First up, we have the Nikon Z30. It's coming in at a starting price of just about $610. This is their most budget-friendly option for this type of camera. We have a camera that's nice and lightweight, 350 grams. It has a solid camera sensor, 20 megapixels, solid autofocus with face and eye detection, 4K video capabilities, and a nice flip-in touchscreen. Has a nice lens selection, 4K video with a record limit of 125 minutes. All around, nice budget camera. Let's go ahead and move on to the next camera, the Nikon Z6 Mark II. Here we have a price point of just about $1,600. There are a few other in-between options that you could take a look at, but this is the one that I thought was worth mentioning. Something cool about this camera is that it has dual SD card slots. What's the point of that? Well, you could record what you're filming to both cards at the same time. It's always nice to have a backup just in case something goes wrong with the first one. It's not always necessary, but it is a nice feature to have. 14 frames per second. You could take 14 photos in a second, so you can get some nice action shots. And now we have 4K at 60 frames per second. In other words, 4K slow motion. Something to keep in mind is that if you want to shoot at 4K in slow motion, the camera is going to zoom in just a little bit and you're going to have a little bit of a crop. The Z6 Mark II has a 24 megapixel full frame sensor, which basically means the sensor is going to be a little bit bigger than the other ones that we've looked at, and that results in better low light performance. Here we have solid autofocus. As you can see, each one of these squares represents where the autofocus will focus on in the image. And we have eye detection, so that way if you're doing talking head videos like this one, the focus will be on your eye. Now, for my videographers and filmmakers out there, one cool feature about this camera is that you can plug it into an external recorder and get raw image capabilities. Again, this is another feature that is totally overkill for a majority of beginners, but it's nice to know that this camera is capable of high quality video. It has that image stabilization, and you can live stream with this camera. Now, I was hesitant to add this camera to this list simply because it doesn't have that flip out screen like the other cameras do. But considering all the features that it has along with the price point, I thought it was a pretty solid option. Lastly, we have the Nikon ZF. This one is the highest priced Nikon camera, coming in at just under $2,000, but it's definitely designed with the content creator in mind. And in my opinion, the camera body itself has got to be the coolest of all of the cameras that I've showed you today. It has a really cool retro vibe to it, a nice vintage camera aesthetic that I'm really just drawn to. And this one does have a flip screen. We appreciate that. You could choose different colors. Has a full frame sensor, so you're gonna get some good low light capability, a nice clean image, solid autofocus, good low light capabilities, good image stabilization, 4K slow motion if that's what you're into. And this camera also does 4K at regular speed, and it has a lot of cool video features like 4K oversampled from 6K. So again, this camera is taking a nice 6K image, squeezing it down into a 4K image, and that means you're gonna have a sharper looking image with a little bit more detail than just regular 4K. High quality slow motion. And it also has 10-bit color for my videographer and filmmaker peeps out there. For the beginner, all you need to know is that it has good color capabilities. And of course, over 2 hours of continuous recording. So you're gonna have no problem recording that long form content, those podcasts, YouTube videos, whatever you're gonna create. You shouldn't be limited by 30 minutes. Definitely a higher price point, but it looks like a really fun camera to use. Let's take a look at the chart and see what these cameras look like side by side. If you're that content creator looking for a nice budget friendly option, we have that Nikon Z30 coming in at just about $600, 21 megapixels, no image stabilization. The autofocus is okay when compared to the Sony. There's definitely more autofocus points. And with Canon, there's more autofocus points. So that's something to keep in mind. Autofocus should be pretty solid, but on paper, it looks like Canon and Sony would have better autofocus performance. There's no headphone port. Battery life is okay when compared to Canon and Sony. Again, Canon and Sony outperform this on paper, and it has a higher record limit, so it's really nice for the long form content. Okay, with the Nikon Z6 Mark II, we have a full frame 24 megapixel sensor. It's $1,000 more for that sensor. Has image stabilization, better autofocus, has that 4K slow motion capabilities, but just keep in mind that the image is going to look a little bit more zoomed in because of that crop. Has the headphone port, probably the best battery life compared to the other ones. It's going to be a little bit heavier compared to the Nikon Z30, and it does have a record limit, which is a real bummer, only 30 minutes. So if you want to film long form content, you're gonna have to set a timer on your phone or something like that to go off every 29 minutes, so that way the recording doesn't just stop automatically. Lastly is the Nikon ZF, arguably one of the coolest cameras, or at least coolest looking cameras that Nikon has to offer. Here again, we have a higher price point, $2,000, full frame camera, 25 megapixels. Just as a reminder, the difference between APS-C and full frame is going to be the size of the sensor. The full frame sensor is going to be a little bit bigger, and you're going to have better low light capabilities because of that. On the Nikon ZF, you have 4K 60, got a headphone port, battery life is okay. Again, not as great compared to something like the Sony a6700 or even the Canon R7. And there's a record limit of 125 minutes. So if you know you want to get into the Nikon ecosystem and you just want something to get you started, something budget friendly, Nikon Z30 is where it's at. If you're somebody who prioritizes photo and you want a camera that also does video, I would look into the Nikon Z6 Mark II. Something that I like about it is that it has the highest battery life compared to the other Nikon cameras on this list. And if you're a content creator who prioritizes video and you also want that camera to take good photos, well, the Nikon ZF, even though it is a little bit more of a pricey option, has a high megapixel count. I think this would be the camera for you solely based on that record limit and additional video features that it has. All right, let's wrap this video up. My top picks, if I was on a budget and I'm comparing the Canon R50, the Sony ZV-E10, and the Nikon Z30, I think I would go ahead, invest a little bit more into that Sony ZV-E10. And for me, what really does it is the headphone port, Audio can make or break your video content, so being able to play it back and make sure it sounds good is huge, and having a headphone port to me is a really big deal. Runner up to that would be the Canon R50, an even lower price point. Great autofocus, great colors, and all around I think it's just a good pick. So that's the budget option. For the content creator who prioritizes photography and wants something that can do good video, well, let's take a look. I'm really narrowing down at something in between either the A6700 from Sony or the Canon R7 because of that higher megapixel count. They both have image stabilization, headphone port, solid autofocus system. They're both really good picks. I don't think you could go wrong with either the Canon R7 or the Sony A6700. But if I had to pick one, I would pick the Canon R7 just because of that higher megapixel count. You'll probably be able to see a little bit of a difference if you were to zoom in on an image and compare those photos side by side. For the content creator who wants to prioritize high quality video and wants that camera to also shoot high quality photos, I'm gonna go ahead and recommend the Sony A6700. Solid price, great features, great lens options. On paper, it looks like a really fun camera, and hopefully I could get my hands on one soon. So now you have a lot of options. Hopefully we were able to narrow down your choices just a little bit. I try to give you as much information as I could without overwhelming you. So if you have any questions, if I brushed over a term that maybe you're not familiar with, just let me know down in the comments and I'm happy to break it down even further for you.
Thanks for checking out this video. Be sure to check out the description to get more info on all the things that we talked about today. If there's a camera that you want more info on that maybe I skipped over in this video, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And lastly, I invite you to show some love on this video, on this channel. It really encourages me to continue making videos like the one that you're watching right now, and it actually makes a difference. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next one.